I call the Minister for Environment and Energy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Indi and acknowledge her constructive contribution to this debate about energy policy in this country. And as you know, it's been a political football for more than a decade now, and it's really been two opposing sides taking their positions, and there hasn't been a lot of meeting in the middle. Now, Mr Speaker, now with the Finkel review, I think we have a real opportunity to consider the recommendations of an expert panel across a whole series of areas when it comes to properly integrating energy and climate policy, in the hope that we can deal effectively with that trilemma we face of energy security, energy affordability, as we transition to a lower emissions future. Now, the national electricity market, which has been the foundation of our energy system everywhere except Western Australia and the Northern Territory, has its origins in the late 1990s. And it is more than 5,000 kilometres in length from Port Douglas in the north through to Port Lincoln, across the Bass Strait to Tasmania. And, Mr Speaker, it is a very powerful network and one which is one of the longest interconnected networks in the world. But what we have seen in our electricity market over the last decade is retail prices, the bills that households have to meet, double over the last decade. Now, when it comes to the public's energy bill, there are a lot of different components and therefore lots of different reasons for this increase in price. 50% of the bill is made up of network costs, transmission and distribution. And we have seen, particularly under the time of the Labor government, the famous gold plating, or infamous gold plating, which saw network companies make a lot of money as the network was built out in the expectation of higher demand, which never eventuated. The coalition government under Malcolm Turnbull is trying to rein in network costs by removing the rights of limited merits review from original decisions of the Australian Energy Regulator. Just recently, we saw the public in New South Wales be shortchanged by $3 billion as a result of a successful appeal to the Australian Competition Tribunal and then to the Federal Court on behalf of the networks against an original determination of the AER. We say that's not good enough. Another component of the electricity bill, about 12%, is retail. And the Turnbull government has announced an ACCC review into the retailers and their margins and the way they operate. Because a recent report of the Grattan Institute said in Victoria alone, consumers could be more than $250 million better off if there were a more competitive sector in retail. In fact, they found that the margins were some 3 times in Australia what it was, or across Victoria, what it was in the United Kingdom with a comparative business. Or indeed that these margins in this retail sector of electricity were significantly higher than in the motor vehicle sector or in the fuel sector or in the food sector. So we are determined to rein that in. Generation costs are about a third of the bill, and they have gone up dramatically over the last 4 or 5 years. And there are 3 reasons why wholesale costs have gone up. They've gone up because gas prices have nearly tripled in the last 5 to 6 years. We are now seeing gas customers being quoted $8 to $10 or indeed $12 a gigajoule, whereas historically in 2013-14 it was about $3 to $4 a gigajoule. And as a result of coal-fired power stations closing, and we've seen 9 coal-fired power stations close in the last 5 years, we have seen gas play a much greater role in setting the price of electricity. Indeed, in 2017, gas set the price of electricity about 24% of the time, which is more than double what it did back in 2004. And so with higher gas prices And secondly, with coal-fired power stations closing, we're also seeing higher electricity bills. And the third reason why we're seeing higher wholesale prices is because of the market uncertainty. The last coal-fired power station that was built in Australia was in Kogan Creek in Queensland 2007. The last gas-fired power station was in Victoria in Mortlake in 2010. And one of the constant factors when you speak to generators is that they say that the lack of regulatory certainty is making them reconsider or abandon investment decisions. Now that's why Dr Finkel has talked about a clean energy target as a possible solution. When it comes to gas, we have announced that we will be introducing export controls and we are encouraging the state governments to lift their moratoriums and bans in order to get more gas out of the ground. Because if we can get more gas supply, then that will, of course, lower the price. So we're dealing with generation, we're dealing with retail, we're dealing with the network costs, and that is part of our plan. At the same time, we recognise there is a very significant transformation taking place in the energy system with a greater penetration of renewables, particularly intermittent power, namely solar and wind. When a wind farm may generate power 35 to 40% of the time and a solar farm about 20–25% of the time. You need battery storage, you need backup power. And that's why one of the recommendations out of the Finkel review is so significant, because it's going to encourage the renewable players to provide their own amount of storage. Now that storage could be gas, pumped hydro, batteries, or dare I say to the Greens, diesel generation. And the point about pumped hydro is it's been a real focus for Malcolm Turnbull and his team. For the first time, we have a Prime Minister who's putting storage at the top of the energy agenda. And I think that can't be understated, Mr Speaker. We understand that the public are facing higher electricity bills. Indeed, it's the most vulnerable consumers in our economy who are doing it the toughest, because as a proportion of their disposable income, they would spend up to 5 times more of their income on energy as a proportion than higher income earners. So that's why it's such a tragedy what has happened in South Australia, with the whole system going black and facing the highest electricity prices across the NEM, simply because a Labor government under Jay Weatherill did not put in place the sufficient planning for a 50% renewable energy target. He welcomed particularly wind but also solar to his state without understanding the need to provide the frequency control and ancillary services, the inertia, the storage that is required to stabilise the system. In Queensland, we've been very critical of the Palaszczuk government, because over there they have seen their generators, Stanwell and CS Energy, not provide sufficient power into the system consistent with the amount of capacity that they are able to do so. There's been gaming of the system, and as a result, it's the consumer who's been shortchanged, even though the balance sheets of the state Labor government have improved as a result, and at the consumer's expense. So, Mr Speaker, we call upon the Queensland government to do more to ensure that lower prices can take place in Queensland, just as we call on the Weatherill government to do the same. And I would say to all the Labor governments that have adopted these reckless renewable energy targets, join up to a federal plan to see a consistent national approach, a holistic approach, as opposed to lots of different schemes in lots of different states pursuing an ideological purpose. And this is where Dr Finkel, I think, has made a real breakthrough, because he has emphasised that the focus should not be so much on the inputs but on the outputs. How do we get to a point of lower emissions consistent with our Paris targets of a 26 to 28% reduction by 2030, at the same time ensure a more stable system and not a repeat of what we saw in South Australia, and of course more affordable power? Because the people of Australia were shortchanged by Bill Shorten and Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd when they saw that electricity prices doubled under the Labor Party when they were last in office from 2007 to 2013. We are determined to right the wrongs of the past and to ensure that we focus, as the Prime Minister has said, on engineering and economics to get a better, fairer, affordable, secure power system for all Australians.